What's happening, everybody? Welcome into a brand new episode of Crossed Up. Anthony Sanfilippo's here. I'm Bob Wankel, and we have made it. We are now just hours away. I can count them down. We're under 100 hours as we record this thing to the start of the regular season. And man, I am ready. I am ready for opening day. We've made it through spring training. We've made it through the WBC. And Anthony, we finally can talk about what this 2023 season is going to look like, make some picks, make some predictions, and not just about record, but maybe some individual performances and kind of how we expect this whole thing to shake out. But we do have, some recent news here that I think is probably worth discussion ahead of getting into our picks and predictions and our little season preview. And that's obviously the news about Aaron Nola. And I don't know about you. I think that the assumption, though, and I think we touched on this earlier in the spring, the assumption was that these two sides would probably find common ground ahead of opening day. They'd probably get a deal done. The Phillies are aggressive. They are willing to spend. And Aaron Nola is a lifelong Philly and seemingly a reasonable guy. But they're not going to get a deal done ahead of opening day. They're pushing this thing off. And I guess in addition to your general thoughts on the situation, I guess I would ask you, are you surprised? Are you surprised at the impasse that has developed here as these negotiations have worn on?
I am. I thought that the Phillies would be smarter than this. And it's really come down to both sides taking a pretty significant gamble. And I thought that the Phillies would look at it and say, you know what? I know it's hard to give a second contract to the same player without him really hitting free agency unless he's one of those generational talents where you're going to lock him up at, some ridiculous sum of money for, 10 years or whatever, right? So in lieu of that, Nola already got one contract where he's being paid an affordable sum of money for his talent level. It's a team-friendly contract. So this next one, you almost feel like you have to pay him more. And what I mean by more is you have to kind of give him a little bit extra because he's underpaid in a lot of ways for the last couple of years and this season. So you almost feel like you have to give a little bit back, right, in order to make it happen before you get to free agency. So to me, the Phillies not giving him the deal or not giving him what he's looking for or closer to what he's looking for surprises me. And it also surprises me as a pitcher, unless the two sides are ridiculously far apart, which we haven't heard.
There are some indications of that. I mean, I believe, Howard Eskin, for whatever it's worth, had said, I've heard they're far apart. And it was one of the other beat writers had kind of intimated the same thing. And I don't want to say who it was because I'm not positive, so I don't want to attach their name to it. But it's hard to comment on these negotiations not knowing what the ask is from the pitcher's side, from the player's side. But I would say this. If Carlos Rodon, who's 30 years old, gets 6 years, 162, and Aaron Nola, who will turn 30 years old in June of this season, is a similar pitcher. Now, I know Aaron Nola. I know the deal. He's a face of the organization guy. He's the most innings since 2018, the most starts since 2018. The production's there. We can have the argument about 1A, 1B. Is he a number 2? What is he? But you look at the numbers and you put them all together and you realize that, hey, no matter how you shake them out, this is one of the best pitchers in baseball. So is the ask for $200 million over 6 years? Is it for $220 over 7 years? Is it about years? Is it about dollars? Where does this impasse kind of, come from? And I have to say this, and I know how you feel about Aaron Nola, but my one question here would be, and I know that if he goes out and he has a year similar to the one that he had in 22, this could be even more expensive. But how much more expensive if his ask is that significant right now? Or does he have a year like 2021 where, to be honest with you, man, I know that you tried very hard, but Aaron Nola was fine in 2021. He was fine. He was a guy, 4.5 ERA. If he has that season again, and we have to go into mental gymnastics to make it look like he's a top 10 pitcher, which is what a lot of Phillies fans spent doing in 2021, then, that value is not going to be $200 million. So, like you said, it's a gamble on both sides, but there's this idea that, the Phillies blew it. They didn't get the deal done. How could they not get the deal done? I don't know. I kind of have this idea that if they really were that far apart, not that I'm like, let's side with the billionaire ownership, but given how aggressive this organization's been, and given that I actually think that Dave Dombrowski deserves some benefit of the doubt, this isn't the Clentac McPhail regime. I'm kind of like, my natural inclination is to sort of side with the team right now.
Look, I think that the team is. Look, you're right. It's more of a risk for Nola, I think, than it is the team, because there's the intangible of, does he get hurt? Does he have a down season? Right? Like, so he's gambling on himself to ensure a big payday. There's no question, right? I mean that's the thing. So to me, it's a greater gamble by Nola than it is by the Phillies, because the Phillies can look at it from multiple ways. The Phillies can look at it and say, if the guy goes out and wins the Cy Young this year, we'll pay him. We'll give him what he wants. If the guy has a year, kind of like last year where he's really good, but he's not the best pitcher in the game, we have a number there that we think we can hit. And if he has a bad year, then we'll come back and say, look, our offer still stands. Do
you think that they should, like, if I look at like a Jalen Hurts, right? Let's say the Eagles don't do a deal with Jalen Hurts this offseason, which I think is unlikely, but let's say they don't. There is a little bit of this, like, hey, I need a greater sample size. Like, Jalen, you were phenomenal in 2022. I'd like to see you do it again. And then perhaps we'll alter our numbers, alter our offer based on a growing sample size of excellence. With Aaron Nola, though, and at the age he's at, and I understand that guys are pitching into their mid-30s, deeper into their 30s, and are still able to maintain, a lot of them anyway, are able to maintain some level of consistency. Is it smart business, though, for the Phillies at this point, with the sample size that's already been established, to say, you know what, we're going to alter what we do with you based on your performance this season? Like, certainly if he stinks or he gets hurt, that's going to matter. But should the Phillies need to see a Cy Young level season in order to say, like, now we feel confident about offering you X?
No. I just think that there's levels, right, to it. And I think that that's where I think the Phillies can. So, I don't know. Look, we can sit there and we can argue about Nola all day long, and I get the arguments, but I mean, over the last 6 years, he's averaged 4.7 WAR per season. That's a pretty damn good pitcher. There's not many guys who can do that. So, is that a top 10 pitcher? I think it is. And so when you look at that and say, okay, then pay him like a top 10 pitcher. And what is that? What is that number? Like, I can't give you that off the top of my head. Like, I would have to look it up. I'd have to go onto Sport Track and figure out like who's.
If I said to you right now that you had to commit 6 years to Aaron Nola, $200 million flat, would you do it?
Yeah, that to me I can do. I can do that. I can do that. I wouldn't go much more than that. That's the thing. Like, that's kind of my max. That's kind of where I'd be willing to stop. Like, if he wants to go beyond that, I'm like, okay. No, I don't know if I can go.
You're like $33 million plus per year at that point.
Yeah, and that's I think. But look at what the top guys are getting, right? What are the top guys getting? What's Verlander and Scherzer getting? They're 40, right? Those guys, and so it's like, all right, so he's not at that level, but he's also not middle of the rotation guy, so he falls somewhere in between. The only question that you have to ask yourself is the term. Right, and that could be when you hear Eskin say that they're not close or they're far apart. A lot of times it's more about the term than it is the real money. So sure, sometimes it's actual dollars, right? But a lot of times these guys want to get it. The players either depending. Some of them might want a longer term commitment. Some of them might want options. Some of them might want a shorter term but more money in a shorter term. So I mean, you don't know what the what the negotiations are. Like that's the one thing I worry about with pitchers when you start giving out 6-7 year contracts. It's like, okay, what if there's a Tommy John in there somewhere and it wipes out most of 2 seasons? That's a lot of money to give up.
Well, that's where you start to wonder about the durability and dependability. Like anytime you're committing this type of money at this length with these terms, you have to start thinking about all the different variables and what can go wrong. And so while it certainly should not be used against him that he's logged the most innings since 2018, that he's made the most starts of any starting pitcher since 2018, at the same time, you go, there's some tread on those tires, right? Like there's some mileage here. And you do wonder, like, does that catch up at some point? Is it possible that it catches up at some point? But the other factor here that I think that at least needs to be acknowledged is that it's not just about this negotiation and the player's worth in a vacuum. It's the idea that this is a team that is expected to compete over the next number of years in a really difficult division. And if not Aaron Nola, then who? And when you look at the free agent market, and this is probably part of the negotiation consideration from Nola's camp, it's that, okay, if not me, and you're trying to win a World Series in 2024, then who are you going with? Because it's not going to be Shohei Ohtani, right? So right. Who is the next guy on the market that you can just go out and say, all right, we'll replace you? And the Phillies can feel really good about their young starting pitching prospects, whether it be Andrew Painter, McAble, Griff McGarry. If that materializes, that's awesome to have those options. But you can't rely on that. You can't rely on 2 out of those 3, let alone all 3 guys slotting in here in the next year or 2 and pushing you to a World Series. So you need another veteran front end type of guy at the head of this rotation. And I think that has to at least be acknowledged, because if they don't go that direction and they're not able to make a trade, which they could, maybe they do this via trade, whether it be in the offseason or this summer, and they add somebody else that has that type of, that type of upside, that type of ceiling. But if they don't do that, how do you reallocate that $30 million per year to make your team still a championship contender? Because it would be a brutal loss if there's really not a strong plan B in place.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and that was the next step in this conversation as to why it's risky for the Phillies, is because, if he does not re-sign here, and you have to replace Aaron Nola, regardless of where his season falls, but let's just say it falls along his career average, right? Like that, a very good number 2. Borderline number 1 guy, right? I mean, as if you look at his statistics, that's kind of where he's been to this point. Let's say it's one of those seasons, and then he ends up signing, someone's willing to throw a little bit extra money at him, and he leaves. Well, yeah, you better be right about it, Andrew Painter. You better be right about McAble or Griff McGarry. You better be able to go out and swing a deal for a guy who can come in and be towards, the top end of your rotation. And again, I mean, then you look at a situation at that point, Bob, and this is where I think it's even, the risk becomes great. Wheeler's only signed through next year. And so now you're at your possibility of losing your 2 aces that you have now in the course of the next 2 years. And that could really kill your window, because then all of a sudden, if you're down to just, the organizational depth and maybe bringing in, a couple of guys from free agency, it's not as enticing. It's really not. And so, like, this is why I would do it. Like, I was talking about this with Anthony the other day when they announced that they're going to wait till after the season. And I said, you almost look at this and say, our window to win a World Series is the next 3 seasons. Fair to say, right? The next 3 years is probably your best window. Mm-hmm. So this is our window. So if you have to sign him to a 7-year or so whatever, 6-year contract, $200 million, if you have to do that, you make that financial commitment and you worry about where you're at in years 5 and 6 of that, because that's your window is probably either closed or closing at that point. You worry about it.
How much of it? Because I agree. Like I'm with you on this. Like I think about it in this way. JT Realmuto, Kyle Schwarber, Nick Castellanos, Bryce Harper. This is the window. You got to do it now.
Yeah.
But how much should the Phillies' thought process be about extending the window, extending the run, being more flexible so that it's not a hard stop in 2026.
Well, that's a great question. So let's look at these players, right? So with the exception of Turner and Harper, who are here beyond the next 3 seasons, right? Everybody else, are you bringing these people back once their contracts expire? Castellanos, probably not. Schwarber, probably not, but it depends.
Probably not, but we'll see.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, if he's just your DH, if he's your DH towards the end of his career, just because of how much, how much he controls the clubhouse and really has a winning attitude and mentality. Like if he's just your DH, then you can find a way, then I wouldn't be opposed to it. But I mean, Real Muto, is he going to be your catcher after his contract is over?
No.
Probably not.
There's a very high probability here that Bryce Harper is going to have to play the second half of his Phillies career with an entirely different core group of players.
That's my point. I mean, Turner's the only one that, and beyond the 3 years, and that's no small potatoes, right? That you're going to go into that 2027, 6 and 7 and beyond. And you start your base at your core with Trey Turner and Bryce Harper, even though they're in their 30s, that's still a pretty good starting point. So, I don't think that the Phillies are suddenly falling off the table after 3 seasons, but I think that with this group and with this core, that this is the window is the next 3 years. So you sign Aaron Nola and make it happen and say, guarantee that this is where we're going to be for the next 3 years. Otherwise, it's like we've said, you got to be right about your prospects coming, and you got to be able to work out a deal, because there's not great names in free agency coming out. I mean, after Ohtani, I think Nola is the next best pitcher that's going to be on the market next year.
It's such a strange career. Like, I'm looking at the Baseball Reference page as we're having this conversation about him, and you're like, he's a one-time All-Star.
Yeah.
Now, he's been a top 10 Cy Young vote getter 3 times. He was 3rd in 2018, 7th in 2020, for whatever that season, mattered. All 60 games of it, and then a 4th last year. He was excellent last year, and he was unbelievably good in 2018, and in between he's been somewhere between fine and pretty good. I still think, and I would ask you to kind of put a bow on the conversation here right now, if you had to assign odds to whether or not the Phillies do this, I think for me, a month ago, I would have said 85% chance they get this done. In light of what has happened here in recent days, I would still say it's more likely than not, but certainly less likely. So I would say it's probably somewhere between 55 to 60% right now as it stands.
Yeah, it might be a little bit better than that even. I mean,
they did say all the right things. Both sides did say all the right things coming out of it.
And look, when we were talking to Nola in spring training, I really, really got the sense that he wants to stay here. Like, I really sometimes when you talk to guys and you're having that conversation, that they're either just saying what they're supposed to say or they're blowing smoke, right? I mean, you kind of, I really got the sense looking him in the face when he was talking about it, that he wants to be here. I think that that's a truism. And I think it's true that the Phillies want to keep him. And it's just a matter of finding that sweet spot where both sides are comfortable. Maybe the Phillies paying a little bit more than they're comfortable with, and maybe Nola taking a slightly smaller contract than he's comfortable with, and you get it, right? You get there. And the good thing is I always put stock in what words certain people use, because I think some certain people are very measured about what they say publicly, and I think Dave Dombrowski is one of those guys. And so when you hear him compare this to the JT Real Muto situation, like, to me, it's
not what he did with Rhys Hoskins when this came up earlier this month, which is like, well, Gene Segura.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the difference, right? And so that's what gives me a little bit more confidence that they will get it done. there's a lot of time between now and then, and a lot can go sideways
I
unexpectedly.
hear you.
And so that's why, to me, Bob, you do it now, and you don't wait till the end of the year. But if I'm setting the percentage, I'm probably slightly higher than you. I'm probably about 70% that he's back. That's kind of where I'm at. But I do think it's not. There is a significant enough look. We're talking on a baseball podcast. If I told you that you had a 30% chance of getting a hit, all right, you're a pretty good player. And so if there's a 30% chance that Aaron Nola is not back here next year, that's a significant number to me, right? That's a significant number.
Certainly a more significant number than I would have imagined 2 weeks ago. You know, and I think that's really the ultimate takeaway here. Now, we have some breaking news in the middle of this podcast, which you get the same alerts that I do. Thanks to Phil's media info. But we have some moves here that I guess we could probably just quickly hit on. Really, I don't need to go through the ins and outs of all this, but there's a couple notable ones. Scott Kingery is not going to be on the opening day roster. We knew this, I guess, but given how well he played this spring, I guess there was some outside thought that perhaps, especially after Rhys Hoskins went down, that he could possibly be put on the 40-man and be here opening day. That's not going to happen. And my guess there with him is that he'll go and get consistent work and get consistent at bats. And if he continues to produce, that he could find himself up here at some point. I know that you had previously speculated that if he's not on the major league roster at this point, why even have him? Perhaps you could make a trade. You know, I don't know where that's going to go, but so Scott Kingery not on the team. And then the other one that I think is especially notable, well, really two, I guess, Michael Plasmeyer has been optioned to AAA Lehigh Valley, and infielder Cody Clemens, who we thought had an outside fringe shot at this thing, has also been optioned as well. Yeah. So we know now who is not going to be on this opening day roster. And I don't know if you have initial reactions just to that news, or if you want to jump straight ahead to, okay, so what are we looking at come Thursday?
No, I think it's worth noting just how well Jake Cave played in camp. Yeah. I mean, I think it really is, because here's a guy who was probably not on anybody's radar at all. He was an early under the radar signing. Yeah, they put him on the 40-man, and that was the one thing that kind of piqued my interest. You know, when you see a guy sign early on and be put on the 40-man, it kind of tells you that there's a belief there in the player a little bit. Doesn't always work out, but I think it's an interesting thing. So that, to me, you know, is a really good story, because the guy just went into spring training and just was awesome. And yes, it's only spring training, but he basically told the Phillies, you don't have a choice. You have to put me on this roster. And before the Hoskins injury, it was really interesting to see how this was all going to develop. And we had talked about it like that morning, Bob. Like, we thought that that he had a chance of being ahead of Derek Hall for the DH spot, or for a spot on the roster, maybe playing left or right field, and Schwarber and or Castellanos being the DH more regularly. So, like, to me, that's a significant thing. And I think that it's kind of, you know, people have noticed him playing well in camp. Okay, fine. But I think that there's something more to it. I think that they believe in him a little bit as a regular, or mostly regular. Obviously, you know, when I say regular, if you're a guy that the team looks at saying, hey, you could get 400 at bats in a season, I think that that's a regular player. Right. Even if it's kind of more of a utility or rotational guy, if you're going to get that many at bats, I think that you're kind of a regular, right? And so I think that he's going to get that. I think that you're going to see a lot more Jake Cave this year than you are a couple other of those bench guys. I mean, only Sosa probably is the only other guy that rivals Jake Cave in usage, or at least the plan is going to be that going into the start of the season.
So another interesting tweet here from Marcus Hayes, and I don't know if this is like a Marcus Hayes like speculation tweet, or if I actually saw this with my own eyes tweet. But it said that the Phillies also offered Dalton Guthrie congratulatory handshake. So that's a little bit of a comeback story for Dalton Guthrie, who coming into spring training was sort of considered to be a better than 50-50 bet to make this team. And then he got off to an atrocious start and has rebounded here in the last couple of weeks and played pretty solid ball. And it looks like, at least based on this tweet here and in light of the moves that we've just seen, Dalton Guthrie's also in the starting lineup Monday down there in spring training. So it looks like he is going to be a part of this team. And certainly the value there is the athleticism, the ability to play corner out defense.
So here's my question, because I think that there's still one person extra, because Matt Gelb tweeted it out too while we're all doing this, and we're doing this in real time, so it's kind of hard. But I'm counting 27 players. Is there a thing? Are you allowed to start the year with 27 and then after the first week or 2 weeks you have to bump it back to 26? Is that a thing? Am I missing something?
I'm looking at his roster right now,
because he's got 27 guys, which includes Guthrie, right? I mean, I don't know. Like,
there might be something there. The other thing is, and he actually notes it here, and I wanted to actually quickly pivot to this. Dalton Guthrie's on the bench, barring an outside acquisition. I don't think that there's an obvious candidate. Like, I do believe that in theory, like if we were to do this in a perfect world, the Phillies probably need an outside acquisition to come in that can hit left-handed pitching and play first base, because they just don't have that fit. And we can talk about Nick Castellanos in a moment as a stopgap emergency type of thing. But Darren Ruff, released by the Mets this morning. I have a pretty strong take on that, but
no.
I think you agree with me. Damn it.
No.
I wanted you to go the other way. I wanted to argue about this.
No. And so here's the thing. Like, I mean, I get the fact that he still can hit lefties a little bit, but I think we saw the tail off last year.
Right.
So yeah,
come on, man. You saw the reports out of that. Where are they at? Port St. Lucie? Is that where the Mets play?
Yeah.
He was hitting well in the backfields. He didn't do anything in spring training games, but on the backfields, he was hitting like 600.
Yeah, I don't go down that path. I don't think it's like, I'd rather have Dalton Guthrie on the team than Darren Ruff. Guthrie. He's got versatility.
Hey, I'm not laughing at Dalton Guthrie.
But I mean, he's got versatility, right? Guthrie can play. He's not just an outfielder. He can play all three outfield positions. He can play third base. He can play second base. They even played him a little bit at shortstop in spring training. I don't know if that was just to see if he can do it or not. I didn't pay attention to see if he really did that in the minors at all. But
I will just say this, man. I will say, like, all logic and reasoning aside, it would be pretty sweet to get a Mets cut, have him step in, produce, like, just twist the knife a little bit up, like. And I'm telling you, like as we're talking, like, Matt Gelb just retweeted from Will Salmon, Mets DFA Darren Ruff source confirms. Like, there's Matt Gelb retweeting it. Like, I don't know, may not be irrelevant.
So Gelb also just updated. This is what I get for not actually counting the names on his list, because he said,
I don't know about the 27th man thing.
Yeah, he said he said ignore the fact that I put the number 7 next to the infielders, because I only listed 6, and it would have been, I guess it would have been better if I counted
in
the
real
actual
time.
names.
I was trying to stall when you asked me that. I was like, I don't think so, but I don't.
Yeah,
I don't know,
because he put the numbers next to each position, and I'm like, I'm adding it up: 5 rotation, 8 bullpen, 2 catchers, 7 infielders, 5 out. I'm like, that's 27. There's no way this can be, unless there's a rule that I missed. This can't be right. But
it's funny because, like, I don't really start, like, I'm not starting my actual writing or coverage of this thing until this weekend. And
right.
My wife might be having a baby this weekend, so it might not be for another 2 weeks. But we do these radio hits. We go on WIP, and, like, you got to know the rules. One of the big talking points all spring was, like, what do you think about the new rule implementation? So you got to know them. You got to know what they mean.
Yep.
How it's going to play out. And so I'd like to think like I have a pretty basic understanding of all the new rules and everything. And you said 27th man at the start of the year, and I'm like, I didn't catch that one.
So. Well, yeah, because they did it. Was it last year that they did that?
Well, they had to last year because there was an expanded version of it just because of the delay, getting the season started. So.
Right, and that's what so I was like, did they allow that again? Did I miss something and they allowed that again this year? Yeah. So yes, it was just he put the wrong number. He only listed 6 infielders, so there's only actually 26 names on his list.
So really what this comes down to, and I guess the last bullpen spot, since we're just going through some roster stuff here, is what, Andrew Vasquez, right?
Well, I mean, two. I mean, Junior Marte, who we briefly discussed while I was down in spring training. He was a guy. It was like a name that I mentioned when I was down there on the pod to say, hey, listen, this is a guy that they believe in a little bit. Like, Rob Thompson called his stuff filthy. And when you hear that, it's like it makes you think, okay, they're thinking this guy for the last bullpen spot. Well, then, the injury to Suarez is not going to start the season, and Matt Strom has to get stretched out to be a starter. That opens up another bullpen spot. And we never talked about Andrew Vasquez as potentially that guy. So he seemed to get it. I'll tell you, I think he got it because he can do multiple innings. But I'm going to stand by this because it continued. I think he threw 10. The guy I'm about to say ended up throwing 10 innings in spring training, didn't give up a run, had a whip of 0.4, was striking out better than a batter an inning. I think McKinley Moore is going to get an opportunity this year. I really do.
I mean, I think that's definitely the prevailing thought in light of what happened this spring, and he might be first guy up, second guy up.
I think he's going to have a shot at some point. He's going to get a chance to pitch for the Phillies out of the bullpen this year, and he probably was better than Vasquez in spring training. It's just that they needed a guy who could go multiple innings, and Moore is a more further down the line kind of guy in the bullpen, not a multiple inning reliever. So I think that's the reason Vasquez got it ahead of a guy who performed significantly better than him in spring training.
All right, so we know the rotation, we know the bullpen, we know the infield mostly. We assume that this is the opening day roster, but you do have to, I guess, at least allow for the possibility, even if it's not Darren Ruff, that there is some 25th hour trade here where they find that supplement from the right side that can kind of, hit for some power. We'll see. There is quite a bit as we're recording this, and you could be listening to this on Tuesday or Wednesday leading up to the season and going like, well, the Darren Ruff thing didn't happen. Why the hell did you even bring him up? But there's at least enough buzz going around right now. If you look at social media and trying to make sense of all this, that it is possible, I'd say, that the Phillies do make some move here and that this isn't totally set. But I think for right now, we at least have to just take it for what it is and say that's how they're going to start the season.
I know. I do think that this is it. And this is what I said on Friday. I don't think that they're going to overreact. I don't think that I mean, will they do due diligence and look around and see if there's an option that's better than what they have? I think they will.
Like the Ruff thing makes some sense conceptually, but when you start talking about names like Luke Voigt, it doesn't even make sense. Like, you talk about reverse splits, and I just that's a move for the sake of making a move. Like the Ruff thing, I'm not a proponent of it. I'm not in support of it, but I could at least I understand it.
Yeah, no, I guess I could understand that as much as I understood them giving a contract to Jerry Familia last year. I just don't. I don't go down that route with him. Okay. I think you want to talk about a guy who's just a guy. Like, he's just a guy, and I don't want just guys on this roster. I want guys who are going to come in here and be championship caliber players. And I don't look at Darren Ruff. I don't look nice enough guy, but I don't look at him and say, "Oh yeah, he's got that. He's got that." Yeah, that desire to be the championship player. I don't see it. I just don't. And so I don't. If they go that route, I'm gonna sit here and that's a Matt Klentak signing.
I know.
Okay, I mean,
Saunders, it's Michael Saunders.
Yeah, and that to me is what that would be. So, no, I don't want that. I'd rather do this. I'd rather start with what you have and let it play for a little bit. Look at these first couple weeks. Look, if it's not working, and then you have to go. There'll be guys out there, guys that go unsigned, after being cut, guys that have opt-outs after a couple weeks in the minors or the first month. Look, I was looking up not that this guy is a guy that they would consider because again, he's left-handed, first baseman, but I was just looking around at teams who have players like this, like Colin Moran, just for example,
right?
Minor league player he's in a minor league deal now with the Mariners, and he didn't make the team. He had a non-roster invite, so he goes down to their AAA. He's got 2 opt-outs in his contract where he can leave the minor league team before the end of April, and then again if he doesn't take the first one before the end of May. So there are guys that are going to be out there that have these kinds of things. So if you don't like how things are going to start the season with what you have, you'll be able to find somebody. Believe me, you don't need to go and say, oh, Darren Ruff got cut. Go sign him and bring him in and send down Dalton Guthrie, and we got Darren Ruff on the bench. No, I think it hurts your versatility.
All right, listen, we are 35 minutes in, and we haven't even talked about what the whole show is supposed to be about, which is what is this season going to look like? And so we know what the opening day roster basically looks like. We know who's in, who's out. Let's just get to this, man. I'm really interested, and I've tried so hard not to, show my hand here about my thoughts on this season and the way that it's going to kind of unfold. There's one thing that I think about when I look at this season, and it's that last season played out in a way that nobody expected. And I don't mean that to state the obvious, but what I mean is that the Phillies were not supposed to win the National League last year. They weren't supposed to be in the World Series. If you go back a year ago, even after the Schwarber and the Castellanos signings, the most optimistic views of this team was maybe they win the division, maybe they get into the playoffs, maybe they win a series, but this isn't a World Series team. And they break down all these barriers probably a year before anyone really expected them to. To me, in my mind, it was always about 2023. It was always, what could they do in 2023? So I guess in light of that, has it moved the goalposts? Is this a World Series or bust scenario now that they did it and they've gotten there? Is it they have to get back, they have to win it this time? Or is it what is the goal coming in? Before we talk about the predictions, what makes this season a success?
So this is a great question because Bob, I think it's more, it's a little bit fluid, right? In a sense, let's look at it from the reverse. Let's look at it as what makes it a failure. Okay, a failure is not making the playoffs. That's a failure. Okay, a failure is maybe getting into the playoffs and getting bounced quick, first round, losing the 3-game series, whatever. That's a failure. Okay, but if you get in the playoffs, play well, and you get beat at some point in the divisional round or the NLCS, I mean, are those disappointments? Yes. Are they failures? No. I think there's a level there, right?
I agree. Let me ask you this on March 27th. I have the Padres, despite the fact that everyone and their mother has the Padres. I have the Padres winning the NL West this year. I just think that the Dodgers lost too much. I know they're the Dodgers. I know that they'll add, but I just think that the Padres win the West over 162. So in my scenario, and I'm going to get ahead of myself here a little bit so everyone will know where I ultimately am about to land, but I think that the Phillies are going to finish as the second wild card this year. So if that makes them the 5 going in, then we got a 4-5 matchup in that first round. Well, my number 4 is going to be the Dodgers. They're going to be my first wild card. So I had the Phillies and Dodgers playing in that first series. So my question to you is this. If the Phillies beat the Dodgers in that little 3-game series and they have to do it on the road, is that enough?
If they beat them?
If they beat them. Phillies beat the Dodgers in a 3-game series and then they lose in the divisional round and that's it. Is that enough?
I mean, it's disappointing, but I don't, like I just said, I don't look at it and go, oh, that's a failure, man. They didn't meet the expectation. I don't look at that way.
It's funny because
It's hard. It's hard to beat these teams.
It is hard. And if you go back to the beginning of last season, if you told me, hey, they make the playoffs, I'd say that's good enough for me. But then when they played the Cardinals, despite being on the road, I was like, they're better than this Cardinals team. They should beat this Cardinals team.
Yeah.
It would be disappointing. Then we get to the Atlanta series, and I'm like, they're not beating Atlanta. Atlanta's the better team.
I didn't think so either.
But then they do. And so, like, if they lost that Atlanta series, I would have said, good season, understandable, right? Like, if Spencer Strider gets them back in Philly and Rhys Hoskins never hits the home run and Spencer Strider, and they go down 2-1, and then they get wiped out that weekend, good season.
Yeah.
But then they beat Atlanta. And then they get to San Diego, and I'm like, they're better than this Padres team. It would be disappointing not to win the NLCS.
But we thought it was going to, and the thing of it was we thought it was going to be a longer series.
Yeah.
Like, I remember our predictions, like, we both thought it was a 6-7 game series.
Sure.
And then they beat them in 5. And so, like, I think that elevated the expectations coming into this year a little bit more, too. Like, if that series goes 7 games, and, you know, you just work out a nail biter in San Diego in the 7th game to go to the World Series, we're all excited and we all remember it and it's all fantastic. But is the expectation as high again this year? Maybe a little notch down, right? So I look at it in the reverse and say, well, what makes a successful season? I look at what's not a failure. And so if they get back to the NLCS, I think that gets you to this was a successful year. Again, there will be disappointment because you didn't win the whole thing. But I think if you get back to the league championship series the 2nd year in a row, you have to view that in a successful way.
It's sort of interesting, right? Though, because like last year, making the playoffs, like we always think that it's like a linear progression. So it's like make the playoffs, become a legitimate championship contender, win a championship.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Phillies, they get there and they're knocking on the door and they have a World Series lead after 3 games. And they don't do it. And so in context, like that is disappointing to me, right? But like I think that we've kind of all programmed ourselves into thinking like, well, if they make the NLCS or they make a deep postseason run, of course, it's hard to win a championship. So it's not a failure. But the problem is that the Mets are still really good. The Braves are still really good. And like there's limited opportunities to win a championship here with this core group of guys. And so if they don't win a championship this year, it's 1 year closer to the end. It's 1 year closer to the window closing. So like, and not to mention, you went out and you spent $300 million on a shortstop who might win the MVP award this season.
Mm-hmm.
So like, it's such a unique circumstance because I think we're always able to really define what we would consider to be a success at the start of the season. And yes, it is a fluid thing. And yes, there's levels to it. But for this team, I think that there's not one expectation. Like, I think that it's going to really range. Like, some people are like, this is World Series or bust time now. Because you got John Middleton talking about one World Series win would be disappointing. Well, listen, dude, if the goal is to win multiple World Series, then, like, this year probably needs to happen. So, like, it's just very interesting to kind of come into this and say they might be the 3rd best team in the division. They might be the 5th best team in the National League. But also, it would be disappointing if they don't win the World Series.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird, right? We're in that weird phase where
this is a weird. This is a weird way to view a baseball team.
Yeah,
it's very unique.
Yeah, it's a weird spot because yes, you know, the excitement makes you want to have that greater expectation, but at the same time, if you can separate yourself from that excitement and you look at it within, you know, and say, it's damn hard in this National League to even just get in and then to make a run like you had last year with the talent that's on the teams in the National League. Like that's tough to do. It's really, really hard. And so it's you find yourself getting caught in the middle of, you know, the excitement pushing the expectation and being able to rationally kind of assess the national. It's a tough spot, Bob.
Well, it's almost the complete opposite of what I'll do with the Eagles going into next season. In full disclosure for everybody, if you don't follow Crossing Broad on a regular basis, I'm doing this podcast with Aunt San Francisco, who's number one 49ers fan. And when I look at this going into next season for the Eagles, it's a total opposite of what the Phillies are dealing with in the National League. The National League is stacked. Yeah. The NL East is stacked. In my mind, Listen, I don't think I'm unrealistic. The Dallas Cowboys are a threat to the Eagles in the NFC East next season.
Mm-hmm.
But when I look at the whole scope of the NFC, to me, there's 3 teams right now, as it stands, that can win the NFC next year. The Eagles, the 49ers, assuming that they have a quarterback that can play, which right now I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah.
But I'll allow for the fact that either Brock Purdy or Trey Lance or whoever is going to come in and do a nice job, and they're going to be a real threat. It's a great roster. And then maybe the Cowboys get their shit together, right? Like, those are the 3 options: Eagles, Cowboys, 49ers for me. And in that way, it would be disappointing to me, despite what the Eagles have lost, for them not to get back to at least the NFC Championship game next year. They have a path. The Phillies, this is crazy. Like, we're going to argue in a minute why the Phillies are better than the Mets this season. And we're going to sound like homers to some people when we do it. You know, like, there is a realistic scenario where the Phillies are clearly the 3rd best team in this division. And you know why? Because they were clearly the 3rd best team in the division last year until October. So it's really hard. But I will tell you, like, as a fan, former fan, guy that covers the team, whatever the hell I am, right? Like, I'm this like hybrid of like insane fan and also like disgruntled journalist guy. I think it's a disappointment if this team's not somehow in the NLCS. Like, and I understand it's hard, and I understand that they aren't the most talented team. I get all that. But like, after being where they were last year, you better get to the NLCS this year.
Yeah, well, what if you? I mean, here's a question. And again, let's say that there's a rematch in the division series against Atlanta, and this year they get you.
But you know what, man? And like, yeah,
does that disappoint? Like, I mean, is it but is that a failure? Like, because I don't know.
I do the projection based on what the rosters are right now, and like, so I know that Atlanta has all these young prospects, left-handed pitching prospects that are going to come. Like, I get the whole deal with the Braves, but like, here's one. You know, like, whether this is a prediction or an expectation or whatever the case may be, when the Phillies get to mid-July, if they're not clearly able to like say to themselves, if we get to the playoffs, and not relying on the magic of 22, right? Like, I don't want to hear about that anymore. Like, certainly it's a factor. Intangibles are a factor. Camaraderie, playing for one another is a factor. All that, dancing on my own, postseason match, great. It's great. But I don't want to hear, well, clearly we don't have the best rotation. Clearly our lineup, our bullpen doesn't quite stack up to the other teams in the National League. But we know when the lights get bright, we're going to be able to do it because we did it last year. Or just get us back to Citizens Bank Park and watch that home field advantage work when we get in front of our home crowd, like last year. I don't want to hear that. Like, here's the thing that I do expect. You can't necessarily predict what's going to happen when you get to an NLDS and NLCS against elite level teams. But when you get to the middle of July, if you're not able to look yourself in the mirror with an honest evaluation and say that we are as good as the Padres, as the Braves, as the Mets, you better do something about it. Like, you better do something about it. And it's not a criticism of the Phillies ownership. Like, they're spending big payroll. They want to win. I know they want to win, but you better do something about it if you're not that team, because you better go into October thinking, hey, we might not have home field. We might have to play in the wild card round, but we are really fucking good. And when we get there, we are absolutely going to beat you. And it's not going to be because of magic. It's going to be because we're as good as you are. We might be better than you are.
Yeah.
It's like, it's time, man. It's time. It's time for this team to win a World Series. Like,
yeah, I get it. I get it. And you're not wrong, Bob. I mean, but at the same time, I don't want to overshoot the difficulty, because I mean, we're talking about the National League is just so good. I mean, you're talking about playing a wild card series against the Dodgers in a 3-game wild card, and then after that, probably having to go through San Diego and Atlanta again to get back to the World Series, right? I mean, that's a gauntlet that doesn't exist in the American League. It's just not there.
How does this team ever bridge the gap, right? Like, I feel like we're all comfortable right now saying the Phillies are really good. We're really excited about the Phillies this season. This is great. This might be the best Phillies team we've ever seen. I've heard that said. I think that might be getting a little carried away. You know, when you're talking about teams that had, prime Cole Hamels, prime Ryan Howard, prime Jimmy Rollins, prime Chase, like, let's pump the brakes here a little bit. But This is a damn good team, right? But they're still playing from behind. Like, we like this team. We think the Phillies are going to have a good year this year. We'll get to it in a minute. But we're also conceding the fact that the Braves might finish 7 games ahead of them. Like, you've got to, like, when do they they arrive and like they're the team to beat.
Well,
like,
so here's where I got to put that, and I'll put that in a little bit of perspective, right? I mean, the Phillies have done, to their credit, have done an amazing job of fixing the screw ups of the previous regime to get into the just to get into this conversation of being a World Series contender. The Braves did it the right way by having the development of, young talent and bringing it along, and continue to do it and continue to bring, like when you just see pitchers, Kyle Wright's out, no big deal. They got the next guy, Bryce Elder. Yeah, Bryce Elder, he just jumps right in, no big deal. They got so much depth in the minors that they can overcome what the injuries that happen in the season, or a player not living up to expectations. No worries, we got the next guy up. Michael Harris, where did he come from last year? Like, he came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden he was rookie of the year, best outfield, really good outfielder, and he's going to be a long-term guy there in center. So like the Braves have been doing this for a while. The Phillies just kind of burst into this, right?
Yeah.
And so to sit there and say, well, when are we going to be that Braves team? Well, you might not get there right away, and maybe it's a thing that's still down the road, but you can compete with that Braves team.
Sure.
As you're constructed. It's two different paths to get here, but the reason that the Braves have that they remain a favorite, it's not because you don't have the talent to play with them, but it's because they have the structure organizationally already in place, and you're still building
right.
that. So I think that's the difference between the two teams, and that's why we have the Braves ahead of the Phillies, because they can fill the holes faster and easier than the Phillies can.
Yeah, and I'd like to get to a place where the Phillies could adopt the Braves' ability to say, like, if I compare this to a real estate deal, hey, we noticed that your house is worth $1 million, and in a few years your house is going to be worth $3 million. But I'll tell you what, we'll give you $500,000 for it right now. And you go, sold. I mean,
yeah.
It's like, hey, we have this young talent. Let's lock him up for 10 years and pay him a third of the market price.
Right. Right.
And just, yeah, sure thing. Sounds good. So that's, listen, credit to them. And you said it. It's about the infrastructure. It's about the ability to sustain. But man, like, I would love to be in a year where you open up the odds at a sports book and you say, oh, the Phillies are plus 130 to win the division, and the other team's plus 180. And then in that third place team is plus 435. And I do think as we talk about this season here, it is worth noting, and you and I had spoken about this a little bit previous to the show, but Rhys Hoskins goes down. The win total at DraftKings hasn't changed. It's still 88.5 wins for the Phillies. However, the over on that bet was juiced up as of a week ago. It was like plus 130, plus 135. And now the underside of that is juiced up, which just means basically it costs you more to win money when you bet the under now. When I say it's juiced up. So now it's going to require like $135 on the under of 88.5 wins to win 100 on the Phillies, whereas it would have cost you more to bet on the over previously.
Right.
So, that injury has had a little bit of impact on the odds. And then in terms of the actual division odds, the Phillies were about plus 370, I want to say, as of last Thursday. And as of this morning, last I checked, they were at plus 425. So, listen, we did the Rhys Hoskins conversation last week. What it means, is it going to be harder for them to do this? We don't need to have the conversation again. But odds makers and the betting public are at least looking at this and saying, well, you know what? Two of your prominent middle of the order guys are out. Less likely that you're going to win the division than it was 5 days ago.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair thing. I mean, this is what we're just talking about, right? This is where the Braves are ahead of the Phillies still, in that they have a better depth and they can fill those holes a little bit better. Not to say that the Phillies plan is a bad one here to replace Hoskins and Harper for the first couple of months, but it's that they're going to try and do it in a more piecemeal fashion, whereas the Braves would have a plug and play, right? And that's the difference between the two. But I don't think, for me, Bob, it doesn't change. And I think I said this on the last episode. It doesn't change my prediction as to where the Phillies fall in the division. And it really only, and as I went through the numbers, I thought it could go as many as 2. It ended up only being a 1-game difference in my prediction, losing Rhys Hoskins. So, like, I say that's why I've been a pump the brakes, let's not panic guy, because I just doing it and adding it up in my head. And I like to think I'm pretty good at this, like the season prediction stuff. I might get the individual stuff I might be off on sometimes, but I think on the whole, the teams, I kind of nail it a little bit. And I knock on wood as I say that because I don't want this to be the season that I completely blow up, right? But I kind of look at the whole league and everybody, and I look at all these teams and kind of try and break it down on my own, and I come close. I think I come pretty close. I have a good sense of what these teams are, and yeah, this isn't going to change my prediction much. So, well, why don't we get to it? Why don't we dive into where we see this team and the rest of the sport playing out?
Yeah, so I mean, when I look at this team, I think I've said pretty much my feelings on it. I believe that this offense will be one of the game's best. I do have some concerns about the back end of that rotation. I have some concerns about the depth. Certainly injuries, unforeseen circumstances. We can't predict these things, but we know they're going to happen. And for that reason, as much as I would have loved to, when they did the Trey Turner deal, said to myself, they're going to win the division for the first time since 2011. They're going to break through with a 95-win season. Like, I think that's overly optimistic. I still think Atlanta is the class of this division. I think that they've proven that year in, year out. I think it would take some real red colored glasses to pick the Phillies to win the NL East. So I can't do it. I think the Braves are going to win the East. I think that the Braves are going to win 96 games en route to a division. I do think, however, and this is maybe where, Phillies fans will be, I guess, happy to hear this, and maybe it makes me sound a little bit homerish, but I think Phillies are second best team in this division. And I have big time questions about the Mets' age, their ability to stay healthy, the ability to, we talked about it all the time, man, the last few years, loser energy with the Phillies. Well, guess what, man? There's an organization that reeks more of loser energy than the New York Mets. I don't know what it is. And, for a team that has the hype around it consistently, they're like the Cowboys of Major League Baseball. And I know that the owner wants to spend, and I know that the owner will continue to spend, and I understand the talent. But until the Mets do it, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not picking them. And I wouldn't tell you I'd be blown away if the Mets won the division. I wouldn't fall out of my chair. But going in, I'll go Atlanta 1, Phillies 2, and New York 3. And I got the Phillies winning 90 games on the nose, and I have the Mets winning 88 games.
Well, we are really close, Bob. We are really close because I'm the same order. I have the Braves 1, Phillies 2, Mets 3. I had the Braves with 96 as well. That was the number. Originally, I was going 92 for the Phillies after the Hoskins injury. I dropped it 1 down to 91 wins for the Phillies. And I got them. I do have the Mets at 90. I did give them 90 wins. But yeah, for every reason that you said and more, the Mets are not a team to me. And I'm glad you finally come around on this because I've been saying this about the Mets for a long time. And I was really blown away by their offseason that they made no effort whatsoever to get younger. Like they just plugged them.
They do, in fairness, like they do have 3 pretty elite level prospects that figure into their plans at some point this season, all of which have some pop. That's like the if things go well plan for the Mets.
Yeah, but other than Beatty, who? Who? The catcher, right? Right. I don't necessarily know how many young rookie catchers come up and dominate in their first year. They don't. Like I think he will eventually be a really good player, but he's not going to come in and shatter records off the top. It's just going to be like, okay, that's a nice young player. That's just for that position, but it takes a while.
And we would have had the same conversation. I don't think that anything that's happened in the last week, whether it be Edwin Diaz or Rhys Hoskins, like I think this was my order anyway.
Yeah.
But like the Diaz injury is like, I don't want to do this thing where I'm like, well, listen, I told you in the last show that I think that the Rhys Hoskins injury is more impactful than you do. And you like Rhys Hoskins as a player more than I do. So
right.
Like, go figure. But I think that the Edwin Diaz injury is significantly more impactful to what the Phillies have to deal with Rhys Hoskins. Now, if that's a 1-2 punch of Ranger Suarez and Rhys Hoskins, I think I'd rather have Diaz on the Mets and Suarez and Hoskins on the Phillies going into this thing. But that Diaz injury is real. Like, that is a problem.
David Robertson is now their closer. We were leery about using him out of the bullpen, period, in the playoffs last year. Now he's the closer for the Mets. The rest of their bullpen is a bunch of guys who have bounced around baseball. I mean, I know Ottavino was there last year, but come on. Adam Ottavino is your next best reliever. Then you got Brooks Raley, who I kind of like a little bit. I mean, as a lefty, like a lefty especially, he's good against left-handed pitching, but he's not very good against righties. And that's why he went from Houston to Tampa and now the Mets. Like, he's just one of those guys who's like a hired gun to just get out left-handed pitchers. He's one of the rare, you can't have a loogie anymore because you have to face 3 batters, but that's primarily his role. But then the rest of these guys, like Drew Smith, John Curtis, former Phillies farmhand, who had, I think, one nice season with Tampa, and then now he's kind of bouncing around again. I mean, freaking Tommy Hunter is going to make that team. Tommy Hunter is going to be in that bullpen. Like, what is there that makes you go, oh yeah, after you get through the starters, these are the guys, right? They're gonna lock it down. They're not. And then when you look at the rotation, yeah, Verlander and Scherzer are Hall of Famers. Verlander's 40, Scherzer's going to be 39. They're not throwing 8 innings a game anymore. Like, they're going to dominate you for 5-6 innings, but then you got to rely on that bullpen. And then where do you go beyond those two, right? I mean, because Quintana's out at least half the season, if not longer. And then the rest of the rotation, who knows what Kodai Senga is going to be? I mean, he might be a guy, right? I mean, there was some, okay, great. Cookie Carrasco, I mean, he's 36 himself. And David Peterson, who's okay, just like, he's okay. He's a back end of the rotation guy, but the rotation is 2 studs who can't throw long innings and then a few guys. Like I look at the Phillies, who have similar questions right now in the rotation, but the bullpen in Philly is so much more, in my mind, reliable than what the Mets have.
I mean, for the Mets to be the team that odds makers and a lot of people around baseball expect them to be, like, Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer better do it, like, and not get hurt and not be in their late 30s, 40s. Like, they better be those guys. I mean, you just go back to the Diaz thing real quick. I mean, go around baseball. If a team's closer gets hurt, that's gonna have an impact, right?
Yeah.
And I know that you and I were both kind of like, well, Edwin Diaz is probably going to be in line for regression this year. And you know why? Because he was unbelievable last year. I mean,
right.
The numbers are just preposterous. I mean, you go back and look at this. His ERA plus last year was 2.97.
Yeah.
And whip under 1. He was striking out 17 per 9, less than 5 hits per 9. I mean, he was incredible last season. And to not have that, and not only to not have that, but not have a clear committee of replacements in line to take down that 9th inning is going to be huge.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm with you the way that I view the Mets. And so that's the East. So what does this mean? And I guess I'll just take it and go first with what I see here. I kind of revealed where I was going with this earlier, but I think that the Phillies will finish as the second wild card behind the Dodgers. And so I guess that puts the Dodgers and Phillies playing one another in that opening round. I will, just because I think somehow, some way they get there, I will say that the Phillies win a playoff series. And as it stands right now, unless they get Bryce Harper MVP level back, unless they get Nick Castellanos pre-2022 back, unless Ranger Suarez comes back the end of April and is that guy, I don't have the Phillies really going beyond I don't have them going beyond a series. I just don't think you can continue to rely on, like, we won the wild card and vibes. Like, you've got to, like, I don't know. I see this as like a divisional series and out right
Could
now.
be. It could be, but I'll say this is how the only qualification I'll give you that I think they can get back to the NLCS. I honestly believe the Phillies are the second best team in the National League. I think the Braves are the only team better. So depending on how your playoffs would break down, if you drew Atlanta, if you got unlucky to draw Atlanta in the division series, then yeah, I agree with you. I think that's where the line ends. I feel like I'm saying the same thing I said last year, right? I mean, but I mean, in reality, I think that's what it is. But if you draw the Padres in the second round, and you're healthy again, that's always a qualifier, and you're healthy going into that series, I'll still take the Phillies. I'll still take the Phillies against the Padres, and then you get to the NLCS, and if you draw Atlanta there, then that's probably where it ends. And that's why I say to myself, if they get back to the NLCS but don't make the World Series, I still look at it and say, pretty good season.
Yeah, now listen, I mean, like, and if you're listening to this, you say, oh, come on, man. You got the Phillies just winning one playoff series and they got them getting bounced. But you just said that the expectation is to win the World Series. I'm like, yeah, it is. Like, it is. I think that they have a lot of ifs that need to go right, though. Like, we talk about, like, Rhys Hoskins isn't going to be here. Well, then Derek Hall better be able to hit righties with the power and consistency that a lot of people seem to think that he will. They better have a way to slot in and have that depth be a good supplement against lefties. They better hope that Nick Castellanos is the guy that they now, like, again, I'm laying out the dream scenario here. The Nick Castellanos bounce back. Aaron Nola gives you that Cy Young level season where he's asking for 230 next off season. Zach Wheeler holds up and he continues to be the guy that he's been. I like this team a lot. Like, it's so weird in one breath to say, I really like this Phillies team. I'm super excited for what is about to come up, but I'm also at the same time kind of leveling some expectations where I just don't see that deep playoff run as being like the 5 seed, the 6 seed, and being able to mow down the Atlantas and the San Diegos on the road this time. I just can't bank on that. Like, I can't bank on it. So absent of all of those things happening and probably some major midseason acquisition, which I would not put past this front office, to me, like, they need something. If everything plays out the way that I expected it will, they're going to need some reinforcement. And it's not going to be like Noah Syndergaard or like fringe fifth starter. It's going to be like game changer piece. And maybe they make that move. But as it stands right now, like, you think the Phillies are the second best team in the National League? I probably have them as the third, maybe the fourth, maybe the second. But, like, I'm going to just say third to even it out. And, like, for that reason, I can't just say, yeah, Phillies are going to be in the World Series again.
Yeah, I know it's easy to sit there and say San Diego is better, and their lineup. If the Phillies, once Harper comes back, I think that the lineups are pretty close. I like the top of the Phillies starting rotation better than I like the Padres, and I think the Phillies have a better bullpen. So I put them ahead of the Padres. And I agree that I think that the Padres are going to beat out the Dodgers for the division. I think it's going to be close. I think it's something that could be a 1 or 2 game difference, right? I mean, right, my preseason, I have Padres at 93, Dodgers at 92. And that's because I think a team like Arizona is going to be improved. And I think that the Giants are going to be in it for a little bit before they fall off. But I think those two teams are decent. Enough that you're not going to have a runaway winner in the National League West. But again, if I look at it, assuming everybody is healthy that is on the rosters right now, and knowing who's coming back when, knowing Harper's coming back, whatever. If they're healthy come the end of the year and no moves are made, and of course moves are going to happen, but you go off of what.
Yeah, I mean, we can only go with. I've made predictions in the past with the assumption that the Phillies will make a move or like they will do something of substance. But I mean, we can only call it as we see it currently.
Right, and I think the Phillies are a better roster than the Padres. I just do.
Yeah, so, I think I could even go for that. Like, I'm not going to sit here and try to make the opposite argument and not move or not budge on it. I think that the deciding factor for me is just lower seeded team on the road. And you and I talked last year. It's not like sometimes that plays to the advantage of the road team. And like, I get that. But I think that this idea of like the revenge factor, like I am a big believer in like contacts, situationals, intangibles. And I'm like, man, like, on the road again, lower seeded team, revenge in play. Like, I wouldn't be blown away if it happened, but I just can't sit here and tell you right now and trying to be objective that I personally think that that's going to happen because I just don't.
I mean, yeah, I mean that's fine. That's fair. Look, it's tough. I mean, 162
It's
games.
tough. It's
Yeah,
tough.
a lot can happen in the 162 game. Like I actually, there were a couple of races in here, and a couple of, I think that there were a couple of, we haven't even talked about the Central or the American League. Like there were a
Yeah.
couple things that I think I came into spring training thinking one way, and I'm leaving spring training thinking another.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that one of them was the National League West, and I kind of originally had, even though the Padres went out and signed all those big name players, I had the Dodgers ahead of them to start the spring training, and now I don't. Now I have them ahead of the Dodgers, and I'm not 100% confident on it either.
Do you
but
have
I
all
do.
6 teams? Do you have all 6 teams from the playoff field in the National League last season in the playoffs this season?
There's another switch.
Okay. Is that a St. Louis based switch?
Yeah, I got Milwaukee ahead of the Cardinals, and I just don't see the pitching in St. Louis now. They got injuries, right? Wainwright's not going to start the year. I'm not a Miles Michaelis guy. I'm not a Jack Flaherty. Doesn't impress me. I like the Cardinals lineup better.
Quintana was like the guy for them. Like that was the guy
Yeah.
you were scared of last postseason. And
I mean, and I'm not a fan of their manager. I never was a fan of their manager, and you saw the way he managed against the Phillies. Like he kind of gave them a game, right, in that series. So I switched it, and it's I don't like the Brewers lineup. I still think it's weak, but they have a really good starting staff. They have a good bullpen. And I think that they probably would have won that division, or at least beat out the Phillies for the wild card if they didn't have such a meltdown after the Hader trade last year. So I think that they're going to probably finish ahead. I don't think that they're as good as the other teams. I think the Central is the weakest part of the NL, but I think that they sneak in ahead of the Cardinals just because I don't know where the pitching's coming from for St. Louis. I don't see it. I don't see it in their minor league system ready to come up and contribute at the major league level. I think that the Brewers will hold them off. So that's how I have the NL Central. So that's the one switch. I think that.
So in the National League, in the East, you have the Braves. In the Central, you have the Brewers. In the West, you have the Padres.
Yes.
So then let's kick it over real quick to the American League. Who do you have in the AL East?
Toronto.
Same.
And they're the team I think actually goes to the World Series.
Yeah, same. Actually, I'm. Come on, man. Yeah, so I too have the Blue Jays, who come in right now with the second best odds. I think for the last 10, 15 years, I've just looked at the Yankees and been like, I get it, but I don't get it. And
yeah,
you look at that starting rotation right now, what it was supposed to be versus what it actually currently is.
Yeah.
Talk about having some rotation issues. So I think you look at that, and I just Blue Jays. I'm getting the Blue Jays at 2-1 odds right now. Win the AL East. I'll sign me up for that.
Yeah, no, I think they're the best team in the American League.
And where are you at in the AL Central?
This is one I have a little bit of a surprise. Because I think that it's the weakest division in baseball, and so I think that this is the one where a team that had greater expectations the last 2 years and kind of fell off a little bit is the team that's going to finally come through this year and win that division. That's the White Sox.
The White Sox have better odds to win the AL Central than the Phillies do the AL or the NL East, which is interesting. And I too agree with that as well.
Yeah, I have it Chicago, Cleveland, Minnesota, pretty close between those three teams. I mean, I honestly think it's a really good race, just not great teams. And then Kansas City and Detroit are trailing, but I think that the White Sox pull that one out. I really do.
And dare I ask for your AL West prediction?
Well, I mean, I think it's closer than a lot of people think, and I think Houston still is the team. But I do think that there's some changes.
I like that Seattle team. I really do like that Seattle team.
I do. I like the Seattle team a lot, and I think that they've closed the gap. And I think that a lot of people are sleeping a little bit on Texas. I think that Texas is going to be in that race and could contend for that last wild card.
I feel like Texas needs, and every team to some degree needs the if and if and if. Like these things go right, they will win. But Texas is the ultimate if, and I think it starts with Jacob deGrom.
Right.
If he stays healthy, if he makes 30 starts.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
that.
no, so I have it Houston, Seattle, Texas,
Okay.
and then Anaheim in their typical spot of, being
Amazing.
completely inconsequential, and Oakland's the worst team I've seen play baseball in at least a decade.
So I actually think I know your World Series matchup here. So you said Toronto in the American League. Are you picking the Braves to get out of the
It's
NL?
1992 all over again.
Man, I have it written down
1992 all
right
over
here.
again.
Braves, Blue Jays World Series. I have
Yep.
the same thing.
Yep.
And we did not talk about this ahead of
We
time.
we did not talk about that. What does that tell you, Bob? Well, I'll tell you, I think, and we can make this kind of like, this wasn't going to be one last thing, but I think it's a good one, right? It's a good one last thing. It's my one concern about baseball still is that we've gotten to the point where there are haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier to, and not to say that, that we don't put a lot of time and effort into this, but we're just a couple of guys making baseball picks right on a podcast in Philadelphia in March, and yet we came up with pretty much the same thing. And why? Because I think that it's to a point where there's lack of competition. I mean, there is competition in the sense that the playoff teams are going to be good, and then there's nobody else. I have a hard time saying, well, who are the teams that are going to compete for the wild card spots and just miss? I'm having a hard time with that in both leagues. I guess
Right.
Tampa, is one of them that I think is a team that's got could maybe be. Right now I don't have them in. And I think Baltimore's coming, but I think this is that step back year for them, and I think next year is the year that Baltimore really arrives in the American League. Minnesota. These are and I say the same thing. You look in the National League, it's like the Cardinals are going to be in the race, but boy, I don't like their pitching. I like where Arizona's going. I don't buy the Cubs.
You can tear this off. Here are teams that have, under no circumstances, any chance to be in a World Series this year. No chance. Washington, Colorado, Oakland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Kansas City. You like as you said, Arizona's coming. You kind of like what they're doing. They're not playing in the World Series this year. They're not making the playoffs this year.
Right.
And then you get to that mid-tier of teams where it's like Cubs, Orioles, Marlins, Giants, Red Sox, Rangers.
Marlins, yeah.
Probably not,
Right.
There's like 10 teams that can win. Although I will say, in fairness, and it's a different sport, but I saw one of those freezing cold takes graphics. It was before the NCAA tournament. It was the 8 teams that can win this tournament.
And none of them are left.
None of them are in the Final Four.
Yeah.
So is there some team that comes out of absolute nowhere that we just said? Maybe. But you come in and you have a pretty good idea right off the bat that 16 teams cannot win a championship this year. They just can't.
Well, it's funny you bring up the NCAA tournament, because the comparison I was going to make was I was going to go back in time a little bit, but the reason that that guys like Joe Lunardi and Jerry Palm over at CBS became who they became, right, as these quote unquote bracketologists, is because they were able to figure out a very simple formula before this was all available online. It was available online, but before it was available to the everyday person online. Very simple formula in being able to predict prior to the selection Sunday the 64 teams or 68 teams as it is now that are going to make the tournament, and they would always get either all the teams right or only be off by maybe no more than one, maybe 2, and they rose to prominence because wow, look how good these guys are at picking these. They only miss 1 every year, and in reality, it's not that hard because there's only a handful of teams that are for the last couple of spots, and you just got to weed through those and identify who those two or three teams are going to be. They're going to get in, and who the rest, they're going to be the bubble's going to burst. And now we see that now. Any Joe Schmo can pick the 68 teams coming in, who's going to make the tournament because of automatic bids, and then you figure it out from there. It's the same thing now with baseball. I've gotten to the point where, it's easy to pick 10 of the 12 teams that are going to make the playoffs. Yeah. It's easy.
Yeah.
Doesn't take much. And so it's just a matter of finding those last couple. And even this might be a little bit easier than the college basketball thing, in the sense that, I still think that there's those last teams that we're picking, whether it's I had the 6th seed in the National League. I think both of us do. Is the Mets, right? Is the 6th seed. It's easier to pick the Mets to be the last team to make the playoffs in the National League than it is to pick the 64th team in the NCAA tournament. So I just think it's baseball has watered itself down to that where you either compete or you don't, and there's no teams that are kind of like in the middle.
It's a problem for the game at the highest levels. I don't want to have that conversation at the 120 mark of this podcast. But it is something that I think baseball, when we get into this next labor shit show, which might be the worst of them all to date. I don't expect that one to be a real harmonious, that won't be a harmonious process, but that's something that the game has to figure out. You talk about parity and you talk about worst to firsts, and it's getting much harder, and much more rare for that to happen now.
Yeah, it is. And that the owners are going to go for a salary cap. The players are going to fight it like hell, and I think you're going to have another lockout. I think you're right. I think that's unfortunately the path we're headed. Since we've taken so long, Bob, and it's an hour, we're at an hour and 20 minutes. Do we want to just hold off on the 3 crazy individual predictions until Friday?
Might as well.
I know the season will have started, but will only have been one game.
Might as well.
I don't think that there's anything that's going to happen Thursday that will alter.
Never know. This fan base
that will alter our opinions.
Very much alter the outlook of how people feel.
So cool. Yeah. Why don't we like hold that off till Friday, and then and we'll take it from there. But yeah, the next time we record a podcast, we will have an actual regular season result to discuss, which is awesome.
I'm looking forward to that very, very much so. So for Anthony Sanfilippo, I'm Bob Wankel. Thank you for following us throughout spring training. We are here. The 2023 regular season is about to arrive, and we will talk to you on Friday.